Have you ever looked at your bank account after what felt like a completely normal month and wondered where your money actually went? You didn't buy anything crazy, no luxury splurges, no big vacations, just groceries, a few meals out, maybe some online shopping that didn't feel excessive at the time, and yet somehow the numbers don't add up. You earned your paycheck, you paid your bills, and still there's almost nothing left. That quiet confusion is one of the most common financial experiences in America today. What makes it even more unsettling is that most people don't feel irresponsible when this happens. They feel unlucky. They assume they just don't earn enough yet, or that things will finally start to feel easier after the next raise, the next promotion, the next year. But what if the problem isn't how much you make at all? Because while millions of Americans are stuck saving 3, maybe 5% of their income if they're lucky, there's an entire culture where saving 30, 40, even 50% isn't considered extreme. It's considered normal. Not because people there are richer, not because life is easier, but because they were taught to think about money in a completely different way from the very beginning. And once you see how that mindset works, you can't unsee what's been quietly draining your money this whole time. The uncomfortable truth is that most people don't fail to save because they're bad with money. They fail because they've been trained, slowly and invisibly, to spend it without ever questioning why. Here's where the story takes a turn that most Americans aren't prepared for. In the United States, the average household is considered disciplined if they manage to save around 3 to 5% of their income. That's what we're told is realistic. That's what most financial advice quietly assumes. But now, place that number next to what happens in China, and the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The average Chinese household saves roughly $36 out of every $100 they earn. Let that sit for a moment. For every $100 coming in, $36 don't get touched. They don't get spent. They don't get rationalized away. They get saved. And this isn't a short-term trend or a lucky decade. China's national savings rate has averaged close to 46% for over 70 years, through wars, recessions, political upheavals, and massive social change. During peak years, families were saving more than half of everything they earned, 50 cents of every dollar. Imagine what would happen to your stress level, your sleep, your sense of control, if half your income never disappeared the moment it hit your account. This isn't a small behavioral gap. It's a completely different financial reality. One creates constant anxiety and dependence on the next paycheck. The other creates buffers, choices, and long-term security. And the most important part is this: the difference isn't intelligence. It isn't access to secret investments. It isn't even income. The difference starts with what each culture considers normal spending behavior. But numbers alone don't explain how this works in real life. To understand that, you need to look at one person who took this mindset further than almost anyone, and what happened when millions of people saw her story. That person is Wang Shenai, a 32-year-old woman living in Nanjing, one of the most expensive cities in China. For nearly a decade, she followed a rule that sounds almost absurd to Western ears. She saved 90% of her income and lived on the remaining 10, not for a few months, not during a temporary challenge, for 9 straight years. No lottery wins, no crypto miracles, no inheritance, just relentless saving. By the time she shared her story online, the results were undeniable. She owned 2 apartments outright in a city where housing prices crush most young professionals. When her interview went public, it didn't just go viral. It exploded. Over 500 million people watched a woman talk about saving money. 500 million. That number alone tells you something important. In a culture obsessed with consumption, a story about restraint shouldn't travel that far. And yet it did, because it touched a nerve people don't like admitting exists. What shocked viewers wasn't just how much she saved, it was how normal her life looked while doing it. No dramatic sacrifice, no public suffering, just a calm, deliberate refusal to let money leak away unnoticed. And the debates that followed weren't about whether she was rich or poor. They were about whether this way of thinking was extreme or whether it exposed something deeply broken in how most of us handle money. Because once you see someone live on 10% and still build real security, the usual excuses start to fall apart. And that's when the real discomfort begins. Not because her strategy is unrealistic, but because it forces a question most people would rather avoid. If saving is possible at that level, then what's really stopping everyone else? At this point, most people instinctively push back. They hear stories like this and immediately label them as extreme. They assume it only works because someone is unusually disciplined, unusually frugal, or willing to live a miserable life in exchange for money. That assumption feels comforting because it lets us off the hook. If her lifestyle is too extreme, then we don't have to examine our own habits too closely. But here's the part that rarely gets talked about. The core difference isn't sacrifice. It's starting from a completely different baseline. In many Western households, the default assumption is simple. You earn money, you live your life, and if anything happens to be left over at the end of the month, you save it. Saving is treated like a bonus, something optional, something flexible. In Chinese saving culture, that assumption is flipped upside down. The goal isn't comfort first and savings later. The goal is to protect savings first and then design life around what remains. That mindset shows up in something often referred to as the 10-to-1 rule, the idea that for every 10 units you earn, you aim to live on one. Even in China, most people don't hit that target, and that's exactly the point. When your target is 90%, landing at 50 or 60 still puts you in a completely different financial universe. This isn't about being cheap. It's about changing the filter every spending decision passes through. When you grow up believing that money is meant to be protected first, small expenses suddenly feel louder. That daily coffee, that casual upgrade, that impulse purchase that isn't a big deal, they all start competing against something more important than convenience, your future security. And once that filter changes, spending no longer feels automatic, it feels intentional, which is where the real shift begins. Once that filter changes, something uncomfortable starts to happen. You begin to notice how much of your spending was never really a decision at all. It was a reflex, a routine, a pattern you slipped into without ever consciously choosing it. In the West, we call this living paycheck to paycheck, but that phrase hides what's really going on underneath. Most people aren't broke because they spend recklessly. They're broke because they spend automatically. Think about how money moves through your life right now. Your paycheck arrives, your bills get paid, and whatever is left quietly dissolves into everyday purchases that feel harmless in isolation. A subscription here, a delivery fee there, an upgrade that costs just a little more. None of it feels dangerous, and that's exactly why it works. This is what paycheck mentality looks like in real life. Money is treated as something meant to be used, not protected. Then there's lifestyle inflation, the silent partner that grows alongside your income. You get a raise, and for a brief moment, you feel ahead. But within weeks, your expenses stretch to match the new number. A nicer apartment, a better car payment, more convenience, more comfort, and somehow, you're right back where you started, waiting on the next paycheck. Ask yourself this honestly. If your income went up by 20% next month, would your savings increase, or would your life just get more expensive? And underneath all of this sits dopamine spending, the kind that has nothing to do with need. It's spending as stress relief, spending as reward, spending as a way to feel in control after a long day. The brain doesn't register the cost in that moment. It registers relief. That's why so many people can't remember where their money went, even though they worked hard for it. Chinese saving culture disrupts these patterns by forcing every expense to justify itself against long-term security. Not with guilt, not with deprivation, but with awareness. When saving is non-negotiable, spending becomes intentional by default. The same purchase that feels insignificant in a paycheck-driven system suddenly stands out, not because it's forbidden, but because it has competition. And once you see that, you realize something most people never do. Your financial struggle isn't caused by one big mistake. It's caused by hundreds of small, unquestioned decisions that never felt like decisions at all. Once you recognize these patterns, the next question becomes unavoidable. If so many people struggle with the same habits across different incomes and lifestyles, then maybe this isn't a personal failure at all. Maybe it's the environment doing exactly what it was designed to do. In the United States, most people grow up surrounded by systems that quietly encourage spending and discourage patience. Easy credit, one-click purchases. Monthly payments that make expensive things feel manageable. When the safety net feels solid, saving feels optional. In China, that safety net barely exists. Healthcare costs, retirement, job security, these aren't abstract concerns pushed decades into the future. They're immediate risks families plan for early. When you know no one is coming to rescue you later, money stops being casual. It becomes protective. Saving shifts from a good habit into a survival instinct. Debt plays a massive role here as well. In Western culture, debt is normalized to the point where it barely registers as danger. Financing a car, carrying credit card balances, paying interest for years, in exchange for convenience today. In Chinese culture, debt is treated with suspicion. If you can't afford something in cash, the default assumption is that you can't afford it yet. That single belief removes an enormous drain on future income before it ever begins. There's also the role of long-term thinking, especially around education and family. Money isn't just viewed as personal freedom, it's viewed as responsibility, a way to protect parents, support children, and avoid becoming a burden later in life. When spending is framed against that backdrop, impulse loses its power. Not because people are stronger, but because the system rewards restraint instead of consumption. And that's the critical shift most Americans never experience. You weren't weak with money. You were trained in an environment where spending was easier than saving, faster than planning, and constantly rewarded. Once you understand that, blame turns into clarity, and clarity opens the door to control. So what happens when you take everything you've just seen and actually apply it to your own life? Not in an extreme way, not by trying to save 90% overnight, but by shifting the order of how money moves. This is where one simple idea changes everything: zero-based budgeting. It sounds technical, but the principle is almost embarrassingly straightforward. Before the month even begins, every dollar you earn already has a job: rent, groceries, transportation, and most importantly, savings. Savings stop being whatever happens at the end. They become the first commitment you make. When you pay yourself first, something subtle but powerful happens psychologically. The money that's left no longer feels infinite. It feels finite. And when money feels finite, choices become clearer. You don't need superhuman discipline. You don't need constant willpower. The system does the work for you. Spending naturally adjusts because the boundaries are already set. You stop asking, "Can I afford this?" and start asking, "Is this worth what it replaces?" This shift also quietly kills lifestyle inflation before it has a chance to grow. When your income increases, your savings increase automatically. Your lifestyle doesn't immediately expand to fill the space. That extra money never gets the chance to disappear into convenience and upgrades. It gets protected first. Over time, this creates something most people never experience: margin, room to breathe, options. And here's the part people don't expect. Saving like this doesn't make life smaller. It makes it calmer. You sleep differently when money isn't constantly slipping through your fingers. You think more clearly when your future isn't hanging on the next paycheck. Financial discipline stops feeling like restriction and starts feeling like relief. You don't need to live like someone else. You just need to stop letting money run on autopilot. Because the moment you take control of where it goes, money loses its power to control you. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, the most surprising lesson from Chinese saving culture isn't how much money they put away, it's how differently they relate to money itself. Saving isn't framed as sacrifice. It isn't treated like punishment or denial. It's seen as protection, as stability, as a way to make sure the future doesn't arrive with fear attached to it. In the United States, we're often told that money can't buy happiness, that experiences matter more than savings accounts. And there's truth in that, but what rarely gets said is that constant financial anxiety quietly steals joy from everything else. It's hard to enjoy experiences when you're always one unexpected bill away from stress. Chinese families didn't become disciplined savers because they love deprivation. They became disciplined because they value peace of mind. They understand something most people learn too late. Financial freedom doesn't come from earning more. It comes from keeping control. You don't fail to save money because you're careless or weak. You fail because you were taught by culture, by systems, by convenience to spend first and ask questions later. Once you see that, the shame disappears. And in its place comes something far more useful: choice. You can choose to slow down, to question small purchases, to protect your future before feeding your impulses. And when you do, saving stops feeling like something you're bad at. It starts feeling like something you were always capable of once you were shown a different way to think.